There you are. Our next speaker is Erling Donnelly. He is the U.S. Director of Advocacy and Professional Relations at Pfizer Oncology. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks, Sherry. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here with the Male Breast Cancer Global Alliance. We've always valued the partnership with your organization, so happy to join today. So for today, I'm going to give an overview of how Pfizer has used real-world evidence to support the male indication expansion for Ibrance and a little bit of a background overall as to how real-world evidence is now supporting drug development overall. So just brief background on myself. So as Sherry said, I am from Pfizer. I'm currently the U.S. breast cancer franchise as well as portfolio marketing lead. I've been with Pfizer about 20 years. The first half of my career was on the development side, and then the last, say 10 years have been on the commercial side in a mix of roles in the U.S. and in Europe. And what I'll talk about today is really from the early part of my career where I led the development of Ibrance or palbociclib from the early phase 1 data really all the way through phase 3, a lot of the life cycle studies that we initiated in early breast cancer and other life cycle studies that continue to read out today, but also specifically the work we did from a regulatory perspective to work with FDA and subsequently other global regulatory agencies to support the expansion of our approved indication to include males. And then in addition to working in breast for the last 15 or so years, I had also previously worked to develop 2 drugs for lung cancer. So really excited to kind of share how we've leveraged real-world evidence at Pfizer and now more broadly across the industry. So at Pfizer, we have 4 core values that we live and kind of operate by each and every day. So courage, excellence, equity, and joy. And I think the one that really speaks to the work we've done to leverage real-world evidence to support, increased access and approved therapies for males with breast cancer is the equity core value. So that's really what I'll focus on. And you'll hear me kind of talk about some of the changes we've made to the way we develop drugs in breast cancer specifically, and it all comes back to this core value of equity. So just as a kind of quick reminder, I think probably everybody in this audience is very well aware of the evolving breast cancer treatment landscape over the last 20 or 30 years. But going back to tamoxifen, so that's really, let's say, the modern era of anti-estrogen therapies, that was approved initially without any respect to male, female, postmenopausal, pre or perimenopausal. But subsequently, in the 90s, when the 3 aromatase inhibitors came to market, they were initially in the metastatic setting only approved for postmenopausal women. And then the same with fulvestrant, an anti-estrogen that was approved in 2002. And then you can see that everolimus, that was approved in second or third line metastatic breast cancer. So really in the first line metastatic breast cancer setting in HR positive, HER2 negative, there had been more than a decade before there had been any real significant advances in the treatment landscape. And so then along comes a new class of agents called CDK4/6 inhibitors, and palbociclib was the first in class CDK4/6 inhibitor to move through the development paradigm and ultimately gain approval in 2015. So now I'll fast forward to 2015. So in 2015, Ibrance or palbociclib was approved for use in combination with letrozole for the treatment of postmenopausal women with ER positive, HER2 negative metastatic breast cancer as that initial endocrine-based therapy. And the approval in 2015 was based on a very small phase 1/2 study called Paloma-1 that enrolled about 165 women with postmenopausal status. And at the time, back in the early 2010s, this is the way that studies were run. They were typically run only in women, and they most often excluded women who were pre or perimenopausal. And part of that was related to a thought that by having active estrogen, that might somehow fuel the tumors, and that would make it harder to show that certain molecules in development were active and could gain the necessary safety and efficacy data to support approval. So that was the status as of 2015, or really in the early 2010s. And I'll just say that our initial accelerated approval in 2015 was ultimately converted to full approval on the back of a phase 3 study in over 666 women that read out in 2016 and then supported the updated approval in 2017. Now, so if you recall, prior to this point, all of the studies had really been focused on postmenopausal women and had excluded men. So then in 2016, the Pfizer development team, we were able to gain a subsequent approval based on the results of this Paloma 3 study. So this Paloma 3 study was unique in a couple of ways, and specifically because in this study, this was the first study where we did allow pre or perimenopausal women to enroll in the study alongside postmenopausal women. So we felt that the earlier paradigm of always excluding pre or perimenopausal women was not equitable, and there must be novel science that would help us to enroll these patients and consider them as a kind of common group. And that was, as you can see on the far right, pre or perimenopausal women were allowed to enroll in this study if they had ovarian suppression, so goserelin. Specifically, they had to take that concurrent with their participation in the study. Or if women had an oophorectomy, then they were, by surgery, deemed to now be postmenopausal. So I won't go into any of the data in the studies because that's not really the purpose of this presentation, but we were able to gain this subsequent approval, and that allowed, at least when Ibrance was used in combination with fulvestrant, the expansion to include all women in that specific disease setting, so which was effectively second-line setting. I think the important thing with this study was it showed the industry, or really anyone who worked in breast cancer, that you could run a successful study by including pre and perimenopausal women if you did, allow goserelin or oophorectomy to occur. And that then paved the way for all subsequent studies in breast cancer to then include not just postmenopausal women, but also pre and perimenopausal women. So we've kind of advanced the equity in the field, really leveraging this study as a kind of trendsetter and showing, or precedent setter, and showing the way for future studies. So that was a positive. However, so you go back to 2015, Ibrance was approved in February of 2015. We started to get reports within months of our initial approval that there were men with metastatic breast cancer who were having trouble accessing or really getting insurance reimbursement for Ibrance as a result of the fact that it wasn't technically approved for men with metastatic breast cancer. Usually through discussions with physicians and their insurance companies, it was possible ultimately for men to get approval to gain access and get coverage for Ibrance, but it required extra steps, added time that leads to added fear and just kind of frustration on the patient's part. So we then stepped back and said there must be something that we can do, and we should certainly talk to regulators. And so we started to look at data sources in the US, and I think many people are aware there are claims databases. So as physician writes a script and it goes through the insurance company, that data is ultimately accessible through third-party data aggregators. And so we had noticed that there were upwards of about 500 men who had been treated with Ibrance in the period of 2015 and 2016. That then led us to say, is there a way for us to gather that data and then ultimately share it with regulators to potentially run or to gain a new indication approval? And I think everyone is aware, and here I'll just go into breast cancer. Historically, and everybody in this audience knows that breast cancer is a very rare disease, or male breast cancer specifically is a very rare disease, impacting less than 1% of all breast cancers. And I won't go into the metrics on the side, but specifically, we knew there was this access challenge, and we wanted to figure out how could we address that going forward. Now, in the kind of middle of 2016, we then, as we realized that there were about 500 males who had been treated in the U.S. with Ibrance, despite kind of having access challenges, we thought if we could get access to their data, it would be wonderful to share that with FDA and see would FDA be open to us providing real-world evidence to support a male indication expansion, knowing that it would be effectively impossible with such a rare disease for males with breast cancer to run a new prospective phase 3 study in the kind of classic sense to get FDA approval of Ibrance for males. So we highlighted the access challenges to FDA, shared real-world evidence that we were able to collect from about 20 males treated with breast cancer, with Ibrance in the U.S., and showed what we felt was a very similar safety profile as that seen with women with metastatic breast cancer treated with Ibrance, and had some discussions with FDA. FDA ultimately came back and they recommended an approach where we leveraged the literature, trying to highlight that there's a relatively similar experience between males and females with metastatic breast cancer, or real-world evidence that understands the baseline activity for males with metastatic breast cancer treated with our hormonal therapy. So trying to kind of identify the baseline and then share some limited efficacy data, whatever we could provide, as a way to then show that the experience is similar between males and females, and then that might support a future indication. So it did take us about a year and a half. So in early 2018, we came back to FDA and showed claims data and other real-world evidence data gathered from community oncologists across the U.S. and proposed to FDA that we would submit this to them to gain an updated male indication. They did subsequently agree in that meeting that we could proceed with the submission. And then in 2018, we did file this collective set of data for FDA approval, a review, and then subsequent approval of the new indication. And fast forward to 2019, we did gain the approval, and I'll go into kind of what the basis of that was, which really allowed us to expand the indication to the treatment of all adult patients with HR-positive, HER2-negative metastatic breast cancer, and then specifically removing the restriction to just simply postmenopausal women. And then in combination with fulvestrant, it went from all women to now all patients. So this was, we felt, a very significant advancement for, in particular, males with metastatic breast cancer, but it also was the first time that industry used real-world evidence to support a new indication or an updated indication in the oncology space. So that was also a significant advancement for the field. Now, what was included in that NDA, or what was the basis for this updated indication? It was this retrospective data study that had three components. So first was the claims data, which I'll talk about in a minute, from IQVIA. Flatiron is essentially a company that gathers real-world evidence in electronic health records and data from community oncology practices across the U.S. on a nightly basis. They de-identify that data, so we don't know who the patient is, but we can follow that patient over time. That data is then accessible for specific studies by industry or other academic groups, and we were able to leverage that in part of our submission to FDA. And then obviously Pfizer has real-time ongoing safety surveillance for all approved medicines, as well as all the drugs that are in clinical trial development. And we were able to look into that to see what was the types of adverse events that were being reported back to Pfizer for males that were being treated with Ibrance during the period from 2015 to 2019. And what we saw was that the data showed that there was no new safety signals observed in males with metastatic breast cancer, and by and large, the safety experience was very similar to, if not identical, between the women treated with Ibrance and the males as well. So that gave FDA the confidence to grant us FDA approval. So just double clicking a little bit further into these sources of data and what did they show. So I mentioned the IQVIA claims database. So these are really tracking the individual prescriptions that were provided by physicians to males with breast cancer. And we were able to look between the approval of Ibrance in February 2015 and April 2017. And we saw that there were over 1,000 males with metastatic breast cancer that were treated during that period. And within that, about 1,000 patients, there were 150 that were treated with Ibrance specifically in IQVIA's data. And so we were able to then further dissect that data and say there were 50 men who were treated in the first-line setting. And we were able to then subsequently show FDA what their duration of treatment looked like, how that compared with patients who were treated only with the existing first-line monotherapy, the old standard of care of AI or aromatase inhibitors or fulvestrant. So we were able to make a comparison in terms of duration of treatment. Then the second big subset of data, and I mentioned this already, is this EHR-derived data that comes from Flatiron. So demographically and geographically diverse U.S. database. So has rural kind of patients, has patients that are treated in large academic centers. And we were able to gather there were 60 men with metastatic breast cancer treated in this database between 2015 and 2017. The beauty of this Flatiron electronic health record data is you can get the entire picture of the patient's treatment journey. So what was their health before they were diagnosed? What was their treatment journey, either in the early adjuvant breast cancer setting, or specifically what treatments did they receive during the metastatic setting? When did they develop progression? What kind of adverse events did they face? And any other chart notes can be extracted and de-identified and provided to form what we call patient narratives that can give FDA a very clear picture of what that patient's experience was while being treated with Ibrance or with the kind of old standard of care, just the anti-estrogens. And then lastly, in terms of the Pfizer Global Safety Database that I mentioned, there were over 350 men that had reported, or their physician had reported, some adverse events back to Pfizer. So we were able to analyze that data and show that it was very similar to that seen for women treated with metastatic breast cancer and Ibrance during that period. So I will just kind of caveat that real-world evidence is never necessarily a replacement for the classic prospective randomized phase 3 controlled trial, but recognizing that males with breast cancer is a rare disease, as we've talked about, and everybody in this group knows, and it's a very small data set. So that does, lead to some just, caution as we look at the data. Again, because we're looking retrospectively, we may have incomplete or missing data, and that's just something we have to acknowledge. And clearly, FDA is aware of this and kind of took that into consideration. And then, although the efficacy measures in a prospective phase 3 trial are pretty standard, looking at response rate, so taking scans of patients every 3 months, looking at when did the tumor progress, were there other safety events that the patient may have experienced, and tracking that data in classic RECIST criteria. So this is the criteria that physicians in clinical trials in oncology use to assess, is the drug working or not? That you can't necessarily do in a very rigorous way when you're looking at old data, and patients at different sites or different physician offices may be scanned at a slightly different frequency, and so we have to adjust for those things. And there could be selection bias in that, we didn't have access to every single male who had been treated since Ibrance was approved, but we had a cross section and we did our best to account for other bias that might be existing in that data set. Nevertheless, when FDA kind of saw all the data, they felt that there was sufficient evidence that the safety profile in particular was consistent across males and females being treated with Ibrance, and then supported the updated approval of Ibrance for males with breast cancer. This is just a quick snapshot from the male 59 men who were treated at the Flatiron Health database. So you can see there were 25 from Ibrance plus AI or fulvestrant, and then 34 that received AI only. And we were able to look, and broadly, if you look across the key patient demographics, there was a good similarity between the two groups, and that then gives FDA even more comfort when we think about comparing the safety profiles, or in some cases, limited efficacy. Now, this is just a super quick high-level snapshot of the adverse events reported by males taking Ibrance during this period from 2015 through the beginning of 2018. And as you can see on the far left side, the neutropenia is common, the fatigue as a result of neutropenia. These are the standard patient-reported adverse events that we often see, whether in a clinical trial setting or in a post-approval real-world setting. And FDA, they didn't see anything that was largely divergent between males and females, and thus concluded that the safety profile was consistent between the two patient populations, and that then supported the updated FDA labeling. Now, just in summary, so as I've mentioned, I think now probably once or twice, FDA determined that the real-world data sources supported the updated indication to include males with HR-positive, HER2-negative metastatic breast cancer in the Ibrance label. and no new safety signals were observed in males specifically. And so FDA acknowledged that given the challenges of conducting randomized clinical trials specific to men with metastatic breast cancer due to the very small numbers of patients, non-interventional real-world evidence from multiple sources was useful to delineate the benefit of the Ibrance therapy in this setting. And I think one thing that I'm very proud of is that not only did this pave the way for other companies and other therapeutic areas to leverage real-world evidence to support updated labeling in settings where, in particular, really rare disease types, but the learnings from this effort have led Pfizer to ensure equitable access for men to subsequent registrational studies within our entire breast cancer portfolio. So now, ever since this period in 2019, when we've run breast cancer phase 3 studies and really, I think even our phase 1/2 studies, we always open them up to all women, so not just postmenopausal women, which was the status quo before 2015, but also pre and perimenopausal women, and then in addition, males with breast cancer. So we don't feel that there's any biological reason that males with breast cancer would have a different outcome than women with metastatic breast cancer when treated with these novel agents. And therefore, we do give equitable access in terms of enrollment into the studies. And so I think as we just kind of sit on our industry side, we do need to work with parties like this group, Metastatic Male Breast Cancer Alliance, Global Alliance, to help increase the awareness for males to participate in clinical trials like some of the ones that we have ongoing, so that we can make sure that males are equally represented in our clinical trials going forward. And that then gives FDA and other regulatory bodies the confidence that yes, one, we did open the study to males, two, we have some males who were treated, and three, hopefully that their outcomes and in particular their safety experience was similar to those of the other women in the studies for breast cancer. So with that, I will also just say, as we fast forward now to 2022, we did also gain another indication, or an updated indication to remove any notice to respect to menopausal status for women, leveraging additional real-world evidence. So now Ibrance is effectively indicated for the treatment of adults. It doesn't matter your menopausal status or if you're male or female, across all of the approved indications that we have now for Ibrance. So that has been a very positive thing, and I think it shows also the way that FDA has worked with patient advocacy groups like yourself, as well as industry, to ensure equitable access to novel therapies in breast cancer. And so in the last slide, I'll just highlight, kind of Pfizer's overall ongoing commitment to oncology. If you think about Pfizer as a whole, we're known for many things, from our vaccine business to our oncology business, but we invest more in oncology research and development than any other therapeutic area within the company. And our oncology strategy is really focused around 5 key disease areas, but specifically breast, where we have the largest research and development investment goes into breast specifically. So this is across subtypes. So not only HER2 negative, but also HER2 positive, and some early development work in triple negative breast cancer. We're also very active in genitourinary, hematologic malignancies, thoracic, in particular lung cancer, and GI, notably in colorectal, and in particular given precision medicine advances. And Dr. Bard was talking about biomarkers earlier. The biomarker approaches are really applied across these 5 disease areas. And then what are we trying, kind of what modalities are we leveraging to improve treatment outcomes for patients? It's really enabled by deep expertise in 3 core areas. So small molecules, which is kind of the classic, drug modality that we've leveraged for the last, probably 3 or, kind of 5 decades within breast cancer. And then now moving to antibody drug conjugates, and even in breast cancer, there are a number of new antibody drug conjugates. So it's essentially a biological antibody linked to a chemo payload and dragging that chemo right to the tumor and dropping, as they call the payload or the bomb, and that chemotherapy to hopefully eradicate the tumor at the site of the tumor. So those are an emerging field. We've made major investments in technology, as have others in industry. and then multi-specific antibodies. So this is like the next generation of therapy where you're able to target multiple, let's say, proteins in the body or in the cell, and try to bring together, for example, anti-cancer agents with the immune system, and kind of bringing those two modalities or treatment options together. And that then has the opportunity to significantly propel patient outcomes as we look forward and continue to develop these new modalities. So all of this is done with the goal of accelerating new standards of care for patients with cancer. And I will just say, again, really my pleasure to be here today. We do appreciate the strong partnership we've had with the Male Breast Cancer Global Alliance for the last probably decade or so. So just want to say a sincere thank you, and thank you for the time to talk to you guys today.
Thank you, Erling. I appreciate you being here. For those of you who don't know, we do partner with several organizations, pharma companies. They are listed, and without them, we would not be having this conference. So we appreciate your support. And I think it is about a decade that I've been bothering all of your
Mhm.
patient advocacy people. And thank you for listening on the Ibrance. It was really important. And I think I, for one, was doing a dance the day that I got the information from the FDA. So that was really important to us.
Thank you.
I do have a couple questions for you, and you may have answered these in some way, shape, or form. What exactly is real world evidence, and how is it different from a typical traditional clinical trial?
Yeah, so maybe I'll answer the question in slightly reverse. So in a typical clinical study, as we start the clinical study, we have a long list of data that we are asking physicians to gather from patients and from the healthcare staff that treat the patients. So everything from patient demographics to all the adverse events that they may experience and report every visit that they have to their physician. As well as then prospective, very tightly planned, once a month or every 3 months scans for efficacy and just to see when is the tumor progressing. So it's a very, kind of neatly lined up, and we get uniform data back from all patients participating in clinical trials, which then makes it very easy to compare data from drug A versus drug B. In a real world setting, and sorry, one other thing with these prospective clinical trials is we often have very tight inclusion and exclusion criteria, which is helpful from trying to isolate, is your drug A better than drug B when you have a very homogeneous patient population. But in the kind of post-approval world or in the real world setting, we know patients have a host of comorbidities. There are varying ages, varying health status, a various socioeconomic status as well that impacts treatment and patient outcomes. And so in the real world evidence, it is reflective of treatment in the real world specifically. And people are aware of the electronic health records that you have. So, for example, now after a physician visit, oftentimes if you have a blood draw, you can go on your phone and just look at the app, and you can see what your results are. That data, is increasingly accessible to like large health systems that we can partner with and say, hey, we would like to investigate, the outcome of drug A in a cohort of patients treated in academic centers in New York City, for example. So all that data, if we were to get it, is de-identified, but it does provide some of the basic information about the patient, their treatment outcomes, safety reports that might come in as well. And in that case, because that's electronic health records and it's not prospectively designed to capture specific data points, there is missing data in there, but we can usually glean enough to be able to summarize what the outcomes were for the patient and a cohort of patients treated with drug A, for example. So those electronic health records that are able to be extracted up and centralized, that's broadly what we refer to as real world evidence. So it's data that's collected usually retrospectively, and it's gathered with the assistance of health professionals and health systems who can then aggregate that data and provide it for academic or drug development purposes.
Okay. And on to that, is the data collected globally, or is that separated somehow between, national population and the global population?
Yeah, we often have to do these real world evidence studies on a country by country basis, largely because each country, including the US, have their own health privacy laws. For example, in many of the European countries, you're unable to move health data from one country to the other. And then access to health records in certain countries may be restricted only to the healthcare physician who's treating the patient. In other cases, it might be restricted to academic, researchers specifically. And then in other places, it may be open to being shared and pooled. So most often we would run real world evidence studies in the US and then separately in France or in the Nordic countries collectively. And it's largely just driven by local governmental rules and health privacy laws and legislation.
Yeah, I've run into some of those,
Mhm.
unfortunately. But you guys worked them out for me, so thank you. Does the FDA trust real-world evidence as much as clinical trial data when approving treatments for rare patient groups like men with breast cancer?
Yeah, so I think the preference from the FDA obviously would be what we call the gold standard, which is prospectively randomized, prospectively designed and conducted in randomized phase 3 clinical studies. So that is the gold standard. But in cases where you're dealing with a rare patient population, there or for some other rare diseases, it may not be possible always to randomize a patient cohort to drug A versus drug B, partly because of the rarity of the disease or the limited numbers of patients. So in that case, we have seen, and there was legislation that was passed in the mid 2010s to encourage the FDA to consider other sources of evidence, including real world evidence, as a way to support the advancement of drug development and drug approvals for rare diseases. So FDA, and I highlighted some of the limitations, and FDA is very aware of the limitations. And so when they review real world evidence, they do have to kind of consider those limitations. And we, as well as FDA, take steps to reduce any kind of inherent bias in the way that we collect that real world evidence. And but they do recognize that in certain cases it can be supportive of new drug approvals, especially when you're dealing with rare indications like male breast cancer. So the ideal would be a clinical trial, a classic clinical trial, but in cases where that may not be possible, real world evidence can be supportive of other data that's provided as well to support expansion of use of certain drugs for rare diseases.
Okay, and I think that just answered this next one. Will real-world evidence speed up future drug approvals for male breast cancer or other rare cancer types?
So I think in the short answer is yes, it can. I would say going forward, at least for our own portfolio, but I think it's more broad that most companies now are taking an equitable approach and including males in, especially in the phase 3 randomized controlled clinical trials, so that males can be part of, and in particular, get access to these novel therapies via clinical trials. And then by proxy of participation in that, then FDA has no reason to exclude males from the approved indication unless there's a safety difference, for example. Then they would just by default, because males were included in the clinical trials, and so long as a couple of men did participate in the clinical trials, that then is often the basis for FDA saying we're going to grant an approved indication in line with the patient population that was studied in the clinical trial. So I think we will probably have to rely less on the need for real world evidence for future drug approvals, because I think we in industry are now taking an equitable approach to including males right from the beginning of the drug development process.
Okay, and I think, am I correct in saying that the FDA said they can't be excluded unless it was a very specific reason, like say breast to ovarian, obviously the men wouldn't be included, right?
Exactly. Yeah, and I think the one place where males may sometimes be excluded is in some of the early phase 1 studies while we're still looking at the teratogenicity of a drug. So, for example, by taking drug A, does that potentially cause harm to kind of future children that the males may produce?
Okay. And I think that's the last question I have. But again, if I have any others, I know where to find you and I will get the answers. But thank you so
Excellent.
much for your time today. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Sherry. Appreciate it.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.